Okay, Christopher Life here with Jonathan. I'm gonna ask your pronunciation one more time.
Lefebvre, Jonathan
Lefebvre
Lefebvre. Yep.
and Benjamin Ross, and we are October 11th, and our intention is to sync up on some really important, informative questions. Some of the questions that they're bringing to this conversation, I feel like I have very clear answers and responses to. Others are more of conversations and dialogues. So, you know, Jonathan and Benjamin, as well as anyone listening to this call later on, this should be a very interesting exchange. And to summarize, I think you saw my response and text message
Yep.
to your share on Slack. And basically, do you feel like that's a decent summary? I understand it might be a simplification, but that you want to talk name, advisory board, and presidential. Does that sound
Yep, exactly.
great? So what we opened up the conversation around,
Hold on one second.
I'm just going to suggest that you mute when you're
Okay.
what we opened up the conversation around just a moment before we started the recording was we were kind of joking about wearing hoodies and baseball caps and taking over the country. I think I want to actually start there, which is, I think, a little bit vulnerable and edgy to do on a recording, but it just still feels like it's my truth. And so I want to start there and crack the conversation up a little bit and then go from there. Sound good? So one of the complete driving root causes of what this is all about, both One Nation as a party as well as the 2020 campaign as a catalyzing force, is appropriate to use the frame of national revolution. Now, I say very specifically, this is not about a national revolution to overtake the government or to change the government or to replace the government. What happens in countries is governments are either created by or usurped by and dominated by dictators. And dictators, some of the defining characteristics of a dictator is they wedge themselves into a position of power and then they stay there. And so you need some type of coup or some type of revolution to be able to move them out of their seat of power, because they're not going to do it voluntarily. And they've developed a significant amount of support from the military to provide the physical, violent resistance to anybody who would try and take them out by force. So I perceive the current two-party system in America as the most sophisticated dictator the world has ever seen. And leave it to America to produce the biggest and the best. And I think that we have actually produced the best dictator ever. And this dictator is so cunning that it provides the illusion of choice, and it provides the illusion of participation, and it provides the illusion of authentic democracy. But if you start to look behind the curtain, you realize that the two-party system, as an interconnected, interlocked system, actually is operating like a dictator. It's wedging in its position of power in every way possible to make it as difficult as possible for another party to participate in American politics at national level. It controls the narrative. it controls, but the narrative, as opposed to in a traditional dictatorship, is the narrative of the dictator's the best and the government's doing great and don't try and oppose us. The narrative that's being controlled is this narrative, which is part of the cunningness of the dictator itself, of we've got these red versus blue, this right and this wrong, and they're battling it out to try and have the country operated by the respective value sets of either one of the two platforms. That's the narrative, and that's what makes it so cunning, is because the narrative is the false belief that it's being worked out by two opposing value sets trying to oppose each other. Where if you actually start to look in at the operations of government, you see that where the two-party system is fully aligned is a vast majority of how the government operates. And where the parties differ is a very small minority of governmental facets that happen to very intentionally be the single most divisive social issues in America. And those are the things that are focused on and utilized in order to reinforce the perception that there's a differentiation, right? So if you look at our foreign policies, our policies on how we are a force of empire in the world, our monetary policies, what the health system is, not who pays for the health system, that's the distraction. What the health system is, the prison system, and the list continues to go fairly deep. We realize, holy smokes, everything that those who have the greatest vested interest to not be exposed is similarly not exposed by either of the two parties. So a deeper investigation on 9/11, for example, we have a tremendous amount of evidence to say, hey, maybe 9/11 was actually not what the story was said it was to be. Why do not either one of the two parties have a huge call towards a deeper level of investigation? But the investigation for 9/11 Truth is coming from citizen groups. Why is that not coming from either party? It's a very important question. How are we making money in our country? What are the implications of that? How are we potentially on our way to a financial bubble, an energy bubble? The list goes on and on. The ecological issue is beginning to come into the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party, part of its role is to leverage the emerging social issues that can't be avoided and represent them so that it reinforces this belief in this narrative that the issues that matter most are being hashed out in the two-party system. So that's all kind of part of the whole thing. So what I'm trying to communicate here is that we have a dictator. And what I'm trying to communicate here is that we need a national revolution to oust the dictator. And the only way we have a national revolution is we organize citizens that are not currently vested into that system. And so when we talk about the formation of one nation as a new political party, we're talking about a force of revolution. And I mean that in the literal national sense, while not meaning that we're trying to take over government or destroy the government. It's a celebration of the government, but an acknowledgement that a dictatorial force fueled by ulterior motives has controlled the government, and we want to dislodge that from the government so that the authenticity of the government in service to public interest can be in fact restored. So when we talk about the 2020 campaign, what we are talking about is a catalyzing moment for this actual citizen-driven national generative revolution to begin to assemble and catalyze in order to wrest, W-R-E-S-T, to wrest our government back into the hands of the citizens in service to public interest. And I don't know how far we can get in the 2020 campaign. There's a version of reality that I believe is feasible where we have quantum impact, quantum result. This thing goes completely berserk. And we actually organize our revolutionary force that delivers a strike at the center of the Death Star of the current dictatorial force. And that center of the Death Star is a center of perceived legitimacy. So what we're taking down is the perceived legitimacy of the two-party system. What does everybody say when you start talking to them about governments and new parties and independent candidates? Say, oh, well, the two-party system is the only system that matters anyways, right? So that line right there is a fed line to reinforce the invisibility and the perpetuity of the dictator. So it's that line, red and blue are the only legitimate political vehicles in America, is the single most destructive, vicious, pernicious frame of perceived reality that exists in America that protects the existing dictator as it currently is structured and established. So to take a strike at the center of the Death Star, which is a Star Wars metaphor for those of you who aren't tracking me, is to organize outside of the two-party system so robustly that people loosen, like a loose tooth in a kid, they loosen that perceived ontological crux that the two-party system is the only legitimate political vehicles in America, so that we unlock this complete flurry and eruption and renaissance of civic participation in America outside of the two-party system. Because frankly, I'm not this guy who's always talking about the ruling elite or the ulterior motives, the corporatocracy. Like, that's not my platform. However, what I will say is that those who have ulterior motives, that are using the government, that are using the public in service to private interests, they use the two-party system as their arms into controlling government and into controlling the elected leaders that run the mayors and the states and the nation, so that those ulterior motives can be maintained and preserved. So when the two-party system gets knocked out and blown out and is no longer the only legitimate path towards participation in American government, then the very power source and the power center and the umbilical cord that connects those ulterior motives to the government will begin to be severed. And that severing process with new mayors and new governors and new state legislators and new national legislators that didn't come up through that system, through that systematic manipulation, through the systematic blackmail, through the systematic control structures, that will begin to allow us to more authentically run the United States of America and model, again, the original promise of America, which is by, from, for, and of the people. So that is why I think that it's appropriate to name what we're doing as an expression of national revolution, why I think it's appropriate to consider ourselves as revolutionaries, why we should be thinking about modeling other successful nonviolent revolutions that have occurred in other nations, which there are best practices for, and we should identify ourselves more with that type of categorization than the categorization of simply campaign or party participation or party activities. We are a revolutionary force and to be thinking about ourselves as such. And that is one of the primary drivers behind this theory of change of One Nation Party USA and the Life 2020 campaign.
Yeah, you can hear me.
You're on.